Welcome to the Linguistics course at Southern Utah University. In this video, we'll take a look at graphemics, or writing systems. There are lots of different words that can describe the study of writing systems in linguistics, graphemics, graphology, orthography, and people use these words in slightly different ways. Some of them might use these words just to talk about spelling. Others might use them to talk about simply like something as simple as penmanship. Others use them to talk about formatting on a page and how text appears in a written document. Others use them just to talk about the character system and how that represents words, meanings, or sounds in the language. We're not going to worry too much about the difference between these words, but just to know that our focus here is on writing systems and how that relates to linguistics. One word, though, that we do want to focus on is the word grapheme. Now, grapheme, you can probably guess its meaning if you think about the difference between phonology and a phoneme, or between morphology and a morpheme. So take a minute and make a guess at what a grapheme is. So just like a phoneme is the smallest unit of sound within a language, and a morpheme is the smallest unit of word meaning within a language, then a grapheme is the smallest unit of meaning within the writing system that represents an idea, a word, or a sound within that system. And here on the left we have some different graphemes from maybe the Latin alphabet. We have them from some Native American systems that have been created to represent those languages, Arabic, and then some Asian languages as well. And some of these represent sounds, some of them represent syllables, some of them represent words and ideas. So let's talk about some of these different ways to represent language in written text. Sometimes we can use pictographs, ideographs, or logographs, and in the sense that the written symbol represents maybe a picture, an idea, or an entire word within the language. But these are not necessarily alphabetical. So we often think of Egyptian hieroglyphics as being pictographic or ideographic, or logographic. And to some sense, Chinese traditional characters also are these written symbols that represent words or ideas. We also have syllabic graphemes. So a syllabic grapheme represents two or more, or one or more sounds, usually a vowel, or sometimes a vowel and a consonant. So they represent a syllable within the language. So we have here an example of one from Korean. We have another one here from Japanese. That particular one represents he, so it's the h sound and the e sound together are represented by that one character. Then we have alphabetic systems where there's generally a one sound to one symbol correspondence. So they represent phonemes. So there's one maybe from some Latin systems like A in French, or in English and many other languages. And then we have some from other Asian languages as well, where that symbol represents one sound. Pictographs were considered to be some of the earlier forms of written language and written graphemes. And so they would use them to represent common ideas in the language that needed to be recorded. And so you just had to know all of these characters to understand the meaning of the writing. But over time, there was a desire to represent more ideas or more words using the written system. And so the idea was, well, do we have to create a new character for that, or could we do something else? And what many different cultures started to do was to decide, well, we already have a character that represents this word. Why don't we instead use that word to represent, or that character represent maybe the first sound in that word? And we'll use it as more of a phonological grapheme instead of really representing the original idea or word that it represented. So we can see that that's sort of what's happened here with some Egyptian hieroglyphics. The first four were originally pictographs that represented a word or idea, but they're being used here actually just to represent consonant sounds that are used within those words, and they don't actually represent those words anymore. So, but what we don't have is any representation for the vowels. It's just consonant sounds. Now, because it's just consonant sounds and different vowels could be placed maybe between those consonants, there could be some ambiguity. You know, what do you really mean? Is this a word that has A sounds in it or E sounds in it? So that's when then they put the pictographic tags at the end. We have here the pictograph for man, pictograph for woman, and a pictograph representing many. And this tells us now that the word here that uses that H and M and a W sound is the one that represents humanity, being many people. So this is a way that many pictographic cultures were able to start using phonographical graphemes to represent ideas that there wasn't already a pictograph for. Here's an example here from using traditional Chinese characters. And so what we see along the left is some semantic characters that represent an idea or a word, you know, person, hand, wood, water. And then what we have going across the top are different phonetic characters that represent sounds, or the sounds that many words have. And so what they're able to do then is to create new characters that represent new words that we didn't already have characters for by combining a semantic character with a phonetic sound, and then we just all agree that there's maybe some connection to the semantic character, but it uses this sound because it's close to the pronunciation of this word, and we accept that this new symbol means this new sound. And so we can see that the pronunciation as we go down each column is more or less similar for each of these words, but the actual words are very different. But it's the combination of a phonetic symbol with a semantic character or radical to help us understand, okay, now this is a distinct grapheme from a different grapheme, even though the pronunciation may be similar, or even though it has a similar semantic marker, it's got a different pronunciation character with it. So we can see that some systems use more pictographic or character symbols. Others use more alphabetic or syllabic systems. And this brings up an interesting question: is the English alphabetic system a good system for representing the English language? Take a moment to think about that. Do you agree or disagree with the idea that the alphabet we use in English is a good system? Here's something to think about. We know, as we talked about earlier, that there's about 42 or so, depending on your dialect, phonemes in English. But English uses an alphabet system that has 26 symbols. So we have 42 sounds, only 26 symbols. We've got some problems because clearly there's not enough symbols to represent all of our sounds. What's more, we have some symbols that make the same sound as each other. Some that we really could get rid of that are not useful. So we can think about, for instance, all our vowel sounds. We really only have generally 5 symbols that represent vowels, but we know most American English speakers use at least 13 different vowel sounds. So we tried to do this our best with this by creating some rules about when there are 2 vowels together they make a special sound, or the positioning of the vowel within the word in relation to consonants and other vowels can change the vowel sounds. And so we use this system for spelling in English that helps us apply some regularity and some prediction, but it is complicated, and not everyone easily recognizes what that system is. And then we just have some sounds in English that there is no character for, and so we have to use a combination of characters to represent those sounds. So for instance, we have what we call in English digraphs. A digraph meaning 2 graphemes that are used to represent one particular sound. So we can think of that as the CH sound in English. It's not a C sound, k, and an H sound, h. It's not those two. Instead, it's a completely different sound, and we just use the CH to get that sound, the ch sound. We also do that with the PH in English. Now, we already have a character that represents that, the F sound, but somewhere in the history of English and borrowing from other languages and their spelling systems, we ended up with the PH. We have the SH, which again is not a S sound and a H sound, but a special sound, the sh sound, which is neither of them. We have this with the TH. Older forms of English used to have a character. It kind of looked more like a Y character. That's why you see things like ye old bookshop. It was never a Y. It was this old character that we used in English that was th or th, and it represented that sound, those two sounds. We don't have that anymore, so now we use the TH. There's also the WH sound. Now, this is not part of my dialect in English, but there is a sound that exists for some English speakers, which is kind of like a, it's sort of like an H sound before a W sound, but it's not really quite that either. Sometimes I hear this, especially when I'm listening to General Conference of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and some of the speakers speak an older dialect, and they'll say things like when I, and where, and white. I don't use that phoneme, but that's what that grapheme is trying to represent. And then we have the ZH grapheme. Now, truthfully, in English, we don't use that for any of our spellings. We use that sound in measure and vision, but we don't use that grapheme. But sometimes when we borrow words from other languages, we'll use it. And it's the zh sound, like the zhang. Sometimes people will pronounce that pronunciation represented by the ZH grapheme. So we've talked about all these different ways in English that we use an alphabetic system to represent our sounds, but do we use pictographs in modern English? Or is pictographs just something that older languages use? And the truth is, we do. When I was first a university student and email was starting to gain some traction and all university students could get an email account, people used emoticons when they wanted to convey feeling through a message that they felt was maybe missing from that textual conversation. So we can see there we used characters or pronunciation or punctuation symbols that already existed in English, such as colons and brackets or parentheses. We've got a smiley face, a winking face, maybe a surprised face, and an angry face. But as textual conversation became more common around the world, emoji were created in Japan to help better communicate the concept that emoticons were trying to do. And so we've got a greater variety of emoji that can better distinguish and are faster to type than trying to figure out these different punctuation symbols. And emoji have just exploded. They're always adding new emoji, and they're doing all sorts of things, not just about emotions. Here's just a sampling. What's really interesting about emoji is that they're standardized across computer systems, operating systems, applications, and that there is kind of sometimes referred to as the emoji police, the Unicode consortium. And the Unicode consortium is a governing body that tries to determine what are the symbols that can be used to communicate not only emoji, but also any kind of grapheme, anything that can be typed on a computer or a phone or something else. So we talked a while back about the Deseret alphabet. Somebody petitioned the Unicode consortium to add the Deseret alphabet to the Unicode system. And every time someone wants to propose a new emoji, it needs to be approved by the Unicode consortium. They have to see, is there a need for this? Is there not already an emoji that represents this idea or concept? So there's been petitions to make emoji more greater diversity in terms of sexual representation and racial representation, but also cultural representation, including ideas there that just aren't Western ideas. And so it's constantly growing and evolving, but what each operating system or computer system needs to do is understand that here is what the Unicode Consortium has said is this is what this emoji is supposed to represent. Then they have to create the artwork for it. And that's why when you look at maybe the same text message on different apps or different computers, the emoji could look slightly different. The different way that those applications or operating systems have interpreted the definition of what that emoji should represent. But it's this interesting idea that our language today is continuing to evolve, and even though some linguists thought, oh, it's this evolution from a pictographic culture towards a syllabic or alphabetic culture, now here we're using lots of pictographs in our communication. And what's interesting is those pictographs, or those ideographs, if you want to call them, don't just literally represent the thing that they are the visual representation of. Sometimes then we use a particular symbol to have a metaphorical purpose, or we use it to represent something else, and it becomes commonly known that even though it's this one thing, everyone else understands that in most contexts it actually means this entirely different idea. So here's just some examples of ways that people can try to communicate complex ideas through the use of emoji. So we've got there the comparing apples and oranges, or beat around the bush, some of these different idioms, a perfect storm, going to bed, running late, good luck, be quiet. So there the be is not representing a be at all. It's representing a verb, the copula verb. So just it's interesting to see, and this is something you could try with friends. I mean, there's people who play games like this where they try to communicate complex ideas to each other only using emoji. And people do use it a lot more. There starts to be this shared understanding that certain symbols can carry extra meaning beyond their literal representation. So this is our discussion today, is to talk about how graphemes have an impact on linguistics and how they're continuing to evolve and change, just like all aspects of linguistics are. And it's a great field. It's really interesting, and in my opinion, it's kind of a shame that most linguistic textbooks don't go into deep depth on this topic.